Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today we're talking about album number 4 from Fortet. 4 from Fortet. Everything Ecstatic. Okay, so, Fortet's come off the heels of some of his most celebrated work with Pause and Rounds. He's made a name for himself as the frontrunner of that so-called folktronica genre that critics were throwing around. So now that it's time for him to follow up Rounds in 2005, he decides to do what many of my favorite artists do after putting out some of their most recognizable work: completely redefine himself and make a hard left turn. Everything Ecstatic may still be recognizable as the same guy who made all those previous albums, still retains some of the jazzy vibes that you saw in his other stuff, but it's a lot more out there, experimental, and noisy than anything else he'd ever done before or since. His choice of jazz sampling tended to be a lot more percussive and chaotic. He even introduced what sounds like some analog synth noises, just bleeping and whirring away on pretty much every single track here. It proves to the world that, yes, he is by no means a one-trick pony. He's willing to do something a lot more daring and challenge his audience. And yet, this project isn't often marked by fans as one of his stronger ones. And that includes myself. This project never got the same amount of love from me that even projects like Pause did, save for maybe the track Smile Around the Face. On first return listen, I was like, wow, this is nuts and I love it. Why is this album so constantly underrated, even by me? But by my third listen, it had lost some of its initial luster. It became less and less fun the more time I spent with it. Some of the parts I thought were crazy and creative started to grate on my nerves a little. And then I was like, so that's why it's not higher up on the ranking. For what it's worth, I do still think this album is all around pretty solid. And it gets bonus points for not sounding like any of his other projects, aside from maybe some of those weirder moments at the end of Dialogue. And even then, not really. I can definitely appreciate that he took a risk and find all of it to be pretty interesting, even in its worst moments. I can see the case being made for people saying that this is one of their big favorites. There's definitely something to get out of this album that you can't get out of any others. Just so happens to be one of his least replayable ones for me. So, okay, let's get into individual tracks. This thing starts off in a pretty intense way right off the bat with A Joy, letting you know right off the bat that this is not going to be like any of the other Fortet albums. Got lots of banging drum samples crashing all over the place, maybe joined by a few guitars and some squealing synth licks, and under everything is this really distorted and rough bass line that wavers somewhere between two notes and doesn't seem to quite hit either of them. Also, the whole mix gets like 10 times more distorted and chaotic sounding right at the end, just blasting you with a ton of noise. Needless to say, this opening can be a bit much. It seems like it's going out of its way to disorient and throw off his usual listeners. Almost makes the track title seem like a joke or something. But the rest of this album doesn't actually go that far off the deep end too often. Just look at the second track, Smile Around the Face, which is way brighter and more uplifting and more in line with his older stuff. Well, sort of. It's still more intense than a lot of the stuff on, say, Rounds. But it does deliver on a similar, like, sunny and mood-brightening vibe through all of its shiny melodies, wavering Hammond organ pads, and banging breakbeats. Feels just as fittingly celebratory as the album cover implies. That main whistling melody is another one of the catchiest he's ever come up with. And everything gets a lot warmer and more satisfying around the 3-minute mark as the mix gets filled out with lots of twinkling bells and guitars. Also, there's a lot of the blaring experimental synth licks in the background for much of this thing that don't get in the way, just add some extra flavor. If there's any reason to check out this album at all, it is this track, unquestionably my favorite in the bunch. Anyway, after a 22-second diversion into pitching down a field recording snippet on Fuji Check, which is a little pointless, we then move on to Sun Drums and Soil. This track takes the same sort of percussive experimentations that the opener explored, but it doesn't go nearly as overboard with all the distortion and intentional off-puttingness. It's a very nice meander through lots of banging drum breaks that vary from skittering and playful to super hard-hitting and heavy, some very nice electric piano progressions, some diversions into squelching white noise manipulations, even some blaring horns later, mostly just playing one note. But there is also one pretty cool screeching sax solo near the end. I mean, it definitely also gets pretty intense and chaotic and not nearly as melodically cheery as Smile Around the Face. But somehow there is a pretty nice, sunny, uplifting vibe that carries through this one that's kind of hard for me to put my finger on. It's still plenty of fun and a consistent favorite for sure. Next up is one more interlude called Clouding, which is a lot less pointless than Fuji-check. It's this mix of like clanging cymbals and warm synths and woodwinds that slowly gets denser as you go on, even if it seems like all these instruments are seemingly playing at random and aren't syncing up with each other. Everything is just a little bit off. But it does just barely keep its pleasant vibe in check without falling apart entirely. It's a pretty interesting cut there, and I like it. And then one more big favorite comes after that with And Then Patterns. A part of me does kind of get similar vibes off of this one to the track Unspoken from his last album. And this is not nearly as good as that one, obviously, but those loops of pianos going over these, like, filtering gas leak-ish pads and slower, more toned-down beats do create some nice emotional resonance that most of this album doesn't really try to capture. And when the pianos are joined by some vibraphones, it's just one of the nicest sounding moments on this whole project. Though the last minute of this track kind of abandons that whole more heartfelt mix for some more tuneless, whirring synth licks going over the same drum beats. They get a tad more flickery. And that part's cool too, but it's not quite as compelling as the stuff that came before it. But yeah, still another one of the easy highlights from this thing. It's the last really big, obvious favorite from this album. The last stretch of this album focuses more on those more experimental aspects, and it's generally pretty cool too, though not quite as compelling as some of the stuff that came before. I do quite like High Fives, and the way all of its shuffling drum breaks and constantly whirring synths underscore all of these layered cascades of bells and vibraphones and xylophones and all that kind of stuff. Sounds really pretty, and that's one of the only tracks on here that actually grew on me the more I listened to it. I can definitely mark that one as a favorite, even if there's not a ton of development over time. One that I can't really mark as a favorite, though, is following track Turtle Turtle Up, which has this kinda annoying buzzing bass line going over all these crashing drum breaks and feel like they're going at like slightly different tempos and don't totally match up. Even if he does his best to salvage the track with some more bells and vibraphones later. I mean, it does feel like a lot happened over the course of that very quick 2.5 minutes, but it did kind of start me off on the wrong foot, and it just doesn't stand out as among the stronger moments on here. And then we get Sleep, Eat Food, Have Visions, the longest track on here at almost 8 minutes, the beginning of which is mostly comprised of like several layers of TB303s blipping and squelching away over some sparse guitars, and that's cool, but later being replaced by a bunch of these like banging drum machine beats that progressively get more chaotic and have more weird synth elements and noises beeping at high speed introduced as you go on. I mean, I guess it sounds nice, has some neat evolution to it, and you know, the whole acid techno approach of this track definitely doesn't sound like anything else in his repertoire, but it really doesn't have much of a tune, and it was one of the tracks on here that most notably wore out on me with repeat listens. It's cool, and I mainly like the first 3 minutes, but it's nothing mind-blowing. And then finally we close with You Were There With Me, which is another track I want to like more than I actually do. Mostly a very sparse collection of various wind chime sounds that once again sounds pretty, but also gets a bit repetitive and weirdly isn't as striking as I'd expect a track like that to be. Something just kind of feels missing that I can't put my finger on. That really low-key drum loop that really slowly fades in for much of it is a nice touch, but isn't quite enough to keep me interested. Also, it just kind of fades out uneventfully at the end, so I mean, as far as an album ending goes, it gets the job done, and certainly isn't the least satisfying pick you could have gone with, but it doesn't really stick out to me as a major favorite either. There's a DVD version of this album that gave full music videos to every track, which I have not seen, and moves and then patterns to the end, and honestly that would probably make for a more effective closer than You Were There With Me, but I won't complain too much about the one we got on the standard edition. Also, said DVD version comes with a bonus EP of extra tracks that's also been released separately and you can find on streaming services called Everything Ecstatic Part 2. Most notable for having a 16-minute extended version of Turtle Turtle Up, which predictably gets even more wild and out there than the original. Well, the majority of it sounds like this big jam session where he just lets that last drum break run on endlessly as he just randomly screws around with his synths and makes weird noises with it. And it does eventually get a little tedious, even despite that moment around the 10-minute mark where it just sounds like every sound gets kicked into overdrive and then immediately falls apart for a minute before carrying on where it left off. And surprisingly, actually getting pretty fun again at around the 14-15 minute mark. But needless to say, this is undoubtedly a more exciting experience than the original was. The rest of the EP sort of maintains that kind of live jam feel to everything. It's got a pretty decent continuation of Sun, Drums, and Soil, a weirder and more experimental retooling of Clouding called Watching Wavelength, and a cool B-side called This Is 6 Minutes that has a lot of nice guitar melodies and some pretty solid build-up. Might even be one of the better cuts had it been on the album proper. I mean, I'm probably not going to listen to anything from this EP again after this goes up, but it's all worth giving a shot, especially if you happen to be a fan of the core album. But yeah, that's everything I got on everything Ecstatic. I mean, I'm not gonna act like this is one of my biggest favorites in his catalog. Not all of his experimentations go over that well, and the whole thing does feel pretty fragmented and all over the place. Yeah, that's the other thing. These tracks don't always feel like they directly complement each other or add up to a coherent vibe or feel that carries over everything. And as I kind of mentioned before, Smile Around the Face is probably the only track from this thing that I truly consider among his absolute best. Even if there are quite a few others that I think are really good, like Sun, Drums, and Soil and then Patterns. But like I said, the much noisier and more aggressive approach to everything really does make this project stand out in his catalog, and did really prove that there was more to him than just simple sample manipulations. Even if he'd go to prove that even further with his next two albums, which went into totally different directions as well, and both resulted in more consistent listening experiences, but we'll get to that. Either way, Everything Ecstatic is a pretty fun album, if a bit spotty. It's just as worth giving a shot as any others of his, and maybe a good one to point to for any of those people who think Fortet's music is boring. Say what you will about this album, it is definitely not that. So, I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, it's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review, something linked to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's all for today. See you next time.